The helicopter's rotors cut through the thick Afghan night air as Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison checked his equipment one final time. The team of 12 Navy SEALs was heading deep into Taliban territory for what intelligence called a high-value target elimination mission. Morrison had led dozens of these operations, but something felt different about this one. The intelligence seemed too clean, too perfect. Sitting across from him was Petty Officer First Class Danny Chen, the team's communications specialist. At 26, Chen was one of the youngest operators on the team, but had proven himself countless times in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. His ability to maintain communication links in the most challenging terrain had saved lives on multiple occasions. Tonight he carried the latest encrypted radio equipment, essential for coordinating with command and calling in air support if needed. The briefing had been straightforward. A Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on American convoys was holed up in a compound 15 kilometers from the Pakistani border. Local intelligence sources confirmed his presence and satellite imagery showed minimal security. The mission parameters were clear: infiltrate, eliminate the target, gather intelligence, and extract before dawn. Morrison studied the faces of his men in the dim red light of the helicopter's interior. These were warriors he had trained with, fought alongside, and trusted with his life. They had operated together for 2 years, becoming more than teammates. They were brothers. Each man knew his role perfectly, and they moved together like a single organism in combat. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, announcing they were 5 minutes from the landing zone. The team performed their final equipment checks in practiced silence. Night vision goggles, suppressed weapons, breaching charges, medical, supplies, and communication gear. Everything had been inspected multiple times, but professional habits demanded one last verification. Chen adjusted his radio pack and tested the satellite uplink one final time. Command confirmed clear communications, and he gave Morrison a thumbs up. The team was ready. As the helicopter descended toward the rocky landing zone, Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before every mission. This was what they had trained for, what they lived for. The landing was smooth and silent. The helicopter touched down just long enough for the 12 SEALs to leap out before lifting off again, disappearing into the darkness. Morrison gathered, his team in a tight circle, their faces barely visible even with night vision equipment. Hand signals replaced spoken words as they confirmed their position and began moving toward the target compound. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving. Rocky outcroppings and deep ravines made movement slow and deliberate. The team moved in a tactical formation, with point men scanning ahead while others covered their flanks. Chen stayed close to Morrison, ensuring communication with command remained strong despite the mountainous terrain that often blocked signals. After 2 hours of careful movement, they reached an observation point overlooking the target compound. Through high-powered optics, Morrison studied the building layout. The intelligence had been accurate: a single-story stone structure with a walled courtyard, exactly as described in the briefing. However, his trained eye noticed details that concerned him. The compound seemed too quiet, too empty for a location housing a high-value target and his security detail. Morrison signaled for Chen to establish communication with command while he continued his reconnaissance. The plan called for a simultaneous breach of the compound from 2 directions, with half the team entering through the front courtyard while the others came through the back wall. Air support was on standby 15 minutes away, ready to provide covering fire if the team encountered heavy resistance. Chen whispered into his radio, providing a situation report to the Tactical Operations Center back at base. Command confirmed that drone surveillance showed no changes to the target area and gave authorization to proceed with the mission. Morrison made the final decision. They would execute the plan as briefed. The team split into 2 assault groups, moving carefully down the rocky slopes toward the compound. Morrison led the group approaching from the rear while his second-in-command took the front team. Chen remained with Morrison's group, maintaining communication with both assault teams and command. The coordination had to be perfect to avoid any chance of friendly fire in the confusion of a nighttime raid. As they reached the compound walls, Morrison used hand signals to coordinate the timing. Both teams would breach simultaneously, moving fast and hard to overwhelm any defenders before they could react. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage, and they had practiced this type of assault hundreds of times in training. Morrison's team placed breaching charges on the back wall, while the front team prepared to scale the courtyard wall. Chen monitored radio traffic, ensuring no enemy communications were intercepted that might indicate their presence had been detected. Everything seemed normal, too normal for a compound housing a Taliban commander. The breaching charges detonated with muffled explosions, and both teams poured into the compound simultaneously. Morrison led his men through the gap in the wall, weapon ready, scanning for threats. The building appeared empty, but years of experience had taught him that appearances could be deadly deceptions. What they found inside the compound would haunt Morrison for years to come. Instead of a Taliban commander and his guards, they discovered evidence of a setup. Fresh tire tracks led away from the building, indicating vehicles had departed recently. Communication equipment showed signs of hasty abandonment, and scattered papers suggested the occupants had been warned of the incoming raid. Chen established communication with command, reporting that the target was not present and the compound appeared to have been evacuated. Command ordered them to gather any available intelligence and prepare for extraction. But as the team began searching the building, Morrison noticed something that made his blood run cold. The compound's layout exactly matched their planned approach routes. Furniture had been moved to create clear fields of fire toward the breach points they had used. It was as if someone had known exactly how the SEALs would attack and had prepared accordingly. Morrison realized they had walked into a trap, but the real surprise was yet to come. Chen's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from their Overwatch team positioned on a nearby ridge. Enemy vehicles were approaching the compound from multiple directions, and the SEALs were about to be surrounded. The mission had been compromised from the beginning, and now 12 of America's elite warriors found themselves trapped in hostile territory with dawn still hours away. Morrison's mind raced through their options. The extraction helicopter was 30 minutes away, but they might not have 30 minutes. Enemy forces were closing in, and their only advantages were their training, their weapons, and their determination to bring every man home. What none of them realized was that this night would change everything, setting in motion events that would separate them for 12 long years and test the bonds of brotherhood that held them together. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder as Morrison gathered his team in the center of the compound. Through night vision, he could see dust clouds rising from 3 different directions. They were being surrounded by what appeared to be a significant enemy force. Chen worked frantically with his radio equipment, trying to establish contact with the extraction helicopter and coordinate an emergency pickup. Morrison's tactical mind processed their options rapidly. The compound walls that had provided concealment during their approach now served as a prison. The enemy knew their exact location, and with vehicles approaching, the SEALs would soon face overwhelming numbers. Command had clearly stated that air support was 15 minutes away, but the approaching enemy force would arrive much sooner. Chen finally raised command on the radio, his voice steady despite the dire circumstances. The Tactical Operations Center confirmed that drone surveillance showed at least 40 enemy fighters and vehicles converging on their position. The extraction helicopter was already en route but wouldn't arrive for 28 minutes. Air support was being scrambled, but the closest Apache helicopters were operating in another sector and needed time to reach their location. Morrison made the hardest decision of his military career. Looking at his 11 teammates, men who had followed him into countless dangerous situations, he realized that conventional tactics wouldn't work. They needed time for air support to arrive, time for the extraction helicopter to reach them, time to fight their way out of an impossible situation. The plan Morrison conceived was born of desperation and tactical brilliance. Someone needed to create a diversion, to draw the enemy forces away from the main group long enough for air support to arrive. It would be a suicide mission, requiring one operator to separate from the team and lead the enemy on a chase through the treacherous mountain terrain. Morrison began to volunteer himself, but Chen interrupted him with a counter-proposal that shocked everyone. The communications specialist argued that the team needed their leader more than they needed him. As the radio operator, he could maintain contact while moving independently, calling in airstrikes on his own position if necessary. His equipment would allow him to coordinate rescue efforts even while being hunted. The debate was brief but intense. Every man on the team understood the mathematics of their situation. Without a diversion, all 12 would likely die in the compound when the enemy force arrived. With one man drawing them away, 11 had a chance of survival until help arrived. Morrison's leadership experience told him that Chen's plan made tactical sense. But his heart rebelled against leaving any man behind. Chen sealed the argument by pointing out a crucial factor. He was the fastest runner on the team and knew the terrain better than anyone except Morrison himself. During their 2-hour approach to the compound, he had memorized every ridge, every ravine, every possible escape route. If anyone could survive long enough in the mountains to make the diversion work, it was him. Morrison realized that Chen was right, but the decision felt like betraying everything the SEALs stood for. No man left behind wasn't just a motto, it was a sacred promise that bound them together. Yet sometimes leadership required making choices that violated your deepest beliefs to save the lives of those you commanded. The enemy vehicles were now close enough that the SEALs could hear engines and shouting voices. Morrison had perhaps 2 minutes to decide before the compound would be surrounded completely. Chen was already stripping unnecessary equipment from his gear, keeping only his radio, ammunition, and survival supplies. His face showed no fear, only the calm determination of a professional warrior accepting a dangerous mission. Morrison grabbed Chen by the shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. The words he spoke were simple but carried the weight of a solemn promise. He swore that the team would return for him, that they would never stop looking, never give up hope. Chen nodded, understanding that Morrison meant every word. But both men knew that survival in the Afghan mountains while being hunted by enemy forces was a long shot at best. Chen slipped out through a breach in the compound's north wall, moving like a shadow across the rocky ground. His plan was to circle around the enemy forces and attack their rear elements, creating enough confusion to draw them away from the compound. Morrison watched through night vision as Chen disappeared into the darkness, carrying with him the hopes of 11 teammates and the burden of an impossible mission. The diversion worked better than anyone had dared hope. Chen opened fire on the enemy vehicles from an unexpected direction, using his superior marksmanship training to maximum advantage. The confusion was immediate and total. Enemy fighters who had been closing in on the compound suddenly found themselves under attack from behind. Vehicles turned around, searchlights swept the mountainside, and radio chatter filled the airwaves as they tried to locate this new threat. Morrison and his remaining team members used the confusion to reposition within the compound, setting up defensive positions that would allow them to hold out until air support arrived. Chen's radio transmissions provided constant updates on enemy movements and his own position as he led them deeper into the mountains. Away from his teammates for 30 minutes, Chen played a deadly game of cat and mouse with 40 enemy fighters. His radio calls became Morrison's lifeline, providing tactical intelligence while confirming that the young SEAL was still alive and mobile. Chen's voice remained calm and professional, even as he reported being pursued by multiple vehicles and dismounted fighters. The Apache helicopters arrived like angels of death, their weapon systems lighting up the mountain darkness. Chen's radio guidance allowed them to target enemy vehicles with devastating precision. Within minutes, the force that had threatened to overwhelm the SEALs was scattered and retreating. The extraction helicopter landed in the compound courtyard, and Morrison's team prepared to leave. But Chen's radio had gone silent during the airstrike. Morrison tried repeatedly to raise him on multiple frequencies, while the helicopter crew urged immediate departure. Enemy reinforcements might arrive at any moment, and staying longer risked losing everyone. Morrison faced another impossible choice: leave immediately while Chen's fate remained unknown, or risk 11 more lives searching for their missing teammate. The helicopter pilot made the decision for him. Enemy vehicles were approaching from the east and fuel was running low. They had to leave immediately or risk being shot down. Morrison and his 10 surviving teammates climbed aboard the extraction helicopter, each man carrying the weight of leaving Chen behind in the mountains. As the helicopter lifted off, Morrison watched the compound disappear below them. Somewhere in those dark mountains was Danny Chen, alive or dead they didn't know. The young communications specialist had sacrificed himself to save his teammates, but whether that sacrifice had cost him his life remained a devastating unknown. The flight back to base was conducted in complete silence. 11 warriors who had always returned together now faced the reality of an empty seat among them. Morrison stared out at the mountain landscape, making a silent promise to the darkness below. They would return to find Chen no matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles they faced. None of them realized that Chen was indeed still alive, hidden in a cave system he had discovered during his flight from enemy forces. Wounded and alone, with his radio damaged beyond repair, he watched the Apache helicopters disappear into the distance. His rescue would have to wait, and that wait would stretch far longer than anyone could have imagined. Danny Chen pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the cave, listening to the sounds of his pursuers searching the mountainside above him. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his left shoulder, where shrapnel from an enemy grenade had torn through his gear. His radio equipment lay in pieces beside him, destroyed when he had dove for cover during the firefight that separated him from any hope of immediate rescue. The cave system he had discovered was deeper than he initially realized. What started as a simple shelter had revealed itself to be an extensive network of tunnels, carved by centuries of water flow through the limestone mountains. Chen had explored enough to know there were multiple chambers and at least 2 other exits, making it an ideal hiding place if he could avoid detection. Outside, he could hear vehicles moving along the mountain paths, and the occasional shout in Pashto as enemy fighters coordinated their search. They knew an American soldier was in the area, but the darkness and terrain made finding one hidden man nearly impossible. Chen's SEAL training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape behind enemy lines. His water supply would last perhaps 3 days if he was careful. Food was a more serious problem, as he carried only emergency rations designed for short-term operations. The wound on his shoulder needed proper medical attention, but he had managed to stop the bleeding using supplies from his first aid kit. More concerning was the possibility of infection in an environment where he couldn't properly clean and dress the injury. Chen's mind turned to his teammates and the promise Morrison had made. He knew the team would return for him. That was the SEAL way, the code that bound them together. But he also understood military realities. Search and rescue operations in hostile territory required careful planning, adequate forces, and favorable conditions. All of those factors would take time to arrange. As dawn approached, the sounds of enemy activity gradually faded. The immediate search was being called off, but Chen knew they would return. Local Taliban commanders wouldn't ignore the presence of an American special operations soldier in their territory. They would organize a more systematic search, probably bringing in additional fighters and maybe even tracking dogs. Chen decided to explore deeper into the cave system, while he still had battery power in his night vision equipment. The tunnels wound downward and seemed to connect with other cave networks throughout the mountain. In one chamber, he discovered evidence that the caves had been used before: old cooking fires, ammunition boxes, and even some canned food that appeared to be Soviet-era supplies from the 1980s conflict. The discovery gave Chen hope. If Mujahideen fighters had used these caves during the Soviet occupation, they were probably secure from detection and had sufficient access to water sources. He found a small underground stream in one of the deeper chambers, solving his most immediate survival concern. The water was cold and clear, filtered through limestone rocks that made it safe to drink. Over the following days, Chen established a routine that would keep him alive while avoiding detection. He slept during daylight hours when enemy patrols were most active, and moved through the cave system at night when he could mask any sounds he might make. His shoulder wound was healing slowly, but infection remained a constant concern without proper antibiotics. The hardest part was the isolation. Chen had spent his entire adult life as part of a team, surrounded by teammates who shared the bonds forged by training and combat. Now he was completely alone, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no knowledge of whether his sacrifice had saved his teammates or if rescue efforts were being planned. On the 5th day, Chen heard helicopters in the distance. His heart raced as he recognized the distinctive sound of American aircraft, probably conducting search and rescue operations. He moved to one of the cave exits and tried to signal with a mirror, but the aircraft were too far away and moving too fast to notice a single reflection from the mountainside. The helicopter sounds gave Chen renewed hope, but also highlighted his desperate situation. His teammates were looking for him, but the mountains covered hundreds of square kilometers of the most difficult terrain imaginable. Without his radio, he had no way to guide them to his location or even confirm that he was still alive. As days turned to weeks, Chen adapted to his underground existence. He had found enough stored supplies in the caves to supplement his rations, extending his food supply significantly. The underground stream provided fresh water, and he had even managed to catch small fish that lived in the deeper pools. His shoulder wound healed cleanly, leaving him with full mobility but a permanent reminder of that terrible night. Chen's greatest enemy became despair. Military training had prepared him for physical hardships, but the psychological toll of isolation was harder to combat. He created mental exercises to keep his mind sharp, reciting everything he could remember from his training, planning escape routes, and maintaining the physical conditioning that might be crucial for survival. 3 weeks after the failed mission, Chen heard sounds that chilled his blood. Dogs barking in the distance, growing closer to his mountain refuge. Someone had brought tracking animals to search for him, probably following scent trails he had left during his initial flight through the mountains. His safe haven in the caves might be discovered if the dogs could follow his scent to any of the entrances. Chen gathered his gear and moved deeper into the cave system, following passages he had not yet fully explored. The tunnels seemed to connect with caves throughout the mountain range, creating a vast underground network that might allow him to emerge kilometers from his current location. It was a dangerous gamble. He could become lost underground or find himself trapped in passages too narrow to navigate. The sound of barking grew louder, echoing off the stone walls in ways that made it impossible to determine the exact direction. Chen moved as quickly and quietly as possible through the narrow passages, following air currents that suggested connections to the surface. His night vision equipment was beginning to fail after weeks of constant use, making navigation increasingly difficult. After hours of underground travel, Chen emerged from a cave entrance on the far side of the mountain. The sun was setting and he could see smoke from cooking fires in a valley below where local villagers had built their homes. The sight of civilization was both encouraging and terrifying. People meant potential help, but they also meant the risk of betrayal to Taliban forces. Chen realized that his situation had evolved beyond simple survival. He was now a long-term evader in occupied territory, forced to remain hidden while enemy forces continued searching for him. His teammates believed he was dead. His family had probably been notified of his missing status, and his own government had likely written him off as a casualty of war. The young SEAL made a decision that would define the next phase of his ordeal. Rather than risk exposure by seeking help from local villagers who might betray him to enemy forces, he would remain hidden and survive on his own. He would stay alive through sheer determination and wait for an opportunity to either escape to friendly territory or make contact with American forces. Chen didn't know that his decision would extend his isolation for years rather than months. The war was changing. American forces were being reduced, and the mountains where he hid were becoming increasingly dominated by Taliban and other hostile groups. His survival had become a test of endurance that would push him far beyond anything his training had prepared him to face. 2 years had passed since that fateful night in the Afghan mountains, and Danny Chen had transformed from a Navy SEAL into something entirely different. A ghost surviving in a landscape that wanted him dead. The clean-shaven young warrior who had once carried cutting-edge military technology now sported a long beard and wore clothing scavenged from abandoned villages and fallen enemies. Chen's survival had required him to become someone he never imagined he could be. The rules of engagement that had governed his military service meant nothing in his current reality. He lived by taking what he needed from enemy supply convoys, stealing from Taliban camps, and avoiding all human contact except when absolutely necessary. The moral clarity of his SEAL training had been replaced by the brutal pragmatism of pure survival. His home was no longer a fixed location, but rather a network of caves, abandoned buildings, and hidden shelters throughout the mountain region. Chen had memorized every trail, every water source, every place where he could find food or supplies. He moved constantly, never staying in one location for more than a few days, always assuming that someone was looking for him. The physical challenges were enormous, but the mental strain was worse. Chen had always been part of something larger, a team, a unit, a mission. Now he was completely alone with no purpose beyond staying alive for another day. He talked to himself constantly, conducted mental exercises to prevent his mind from deteriorating, and created elaborate fantasy conversations with his former teammates to maintain some connection to his previous life. His equipment had been replaced piece by piece with items taken from enemy forces or scavenged from battlefields. The high-tech communications gear that had once connected him to his team was long gone, replaced by an old handheld radio he had taken from a destroyed Taliban vehicle. The radio could pick up military transmissions, providing his only connection to the outside world and the war that continued around him. Through these radio intercepts, Chen learned that the conflict was changing. American forces were being withdrawn from many areas. Local Afghan military units were taking over responsibilities, and the Taliban was growing stronger. The mountains where he hid were becoming increasingly dangerous as different factions fought for control of smuggling routes and strategic positions. More disturbing were the intercepted conversations that suggested his former teammates believed he was dead. Search and rescue operations had been called off months earlier, and Chen's name had apparently been added to the casualty lists. His family had been notified, his affairs had been settled, and the military had moved on without him. The knowledge that he had been forgotten created a crisis of purpose that nearly broke Chen's will to survive. What was the point of staying alive if no one was looking for him? Why endure the constant danger, the hunger, the cold, the isolation, if the world had already accepted his death? For weeks, Chen struggled with despair that made every day a battle against giving up. His salvation came from an unexpected source: anger. Chen realized that his survival was more than personal endurance. It was a form of resistance against an enemy that had tried to kill him and his teammates. Every day he remained alive in their territory was a victory. Every successful raid on their supplies was a blow against their operations. He would survive not just for himself, but as a continuation of his mission. This new purpose gave Chen the strength to continue, but it also changed him in ways that would have been unrecognizable to his former teammates. The young SEAL who had followed orders and operated within clearly defined rules became a lone wolf who made his own decisions based solely on survival needs. He learned to kill silently and without remorse, to steal without guilt, and to trust absolutely no one. Years 3 and 4 of his isolation brought new challenges as the security situation deteriorated throughout the region. American forces withdrew from more areas, leaving behind equipment and supplies that different factions fought to control. Chen found himself in the middle of battles between Taliban groups, local warlords and remnants of the Afghan military, all fighting over territory and resources. The changing dynamics also brought opportunities. Chen began following and raiding supply convoys, not just for survival supplies but for intelligence about enemy operations. He learned to read their patterns, understand their communication methods, and predict their movements. In his mind, he was still conducting military operations, even though he had no way to report his intelligence to American forces. Chen's physical appearance had changed dramatically over the years. The fresh-faced young SEAL was gone, replaced by a lean, bearded man whose eyes held the hard look of someone who had seen too much and survived too long in impossible circumstances. His hands bore scars from years of rough living, and his body carried the accumulated injuries of countless close calls with enemy forces. But perhaps the most significant change was in his mind. Chen had developed an almost supernatural awareness of his environment, able to sense danger before it became visible, and to move through hostile territory like a predator rather than prey. The psychological training that had once helped him function as part of a team now served to keep him sane during endless months of solitude. By the 5th year, Chen had become something of a legend among enemy forces in his region. They spoke of a ghost fighter who struck their convoys and disappeared without a trace, who seemed to know their movements before they made them, who could appear and vanish like smoke. Some believed he was a supernatural entity, while others dismissed the stories as exaggerations born of fear and superstition. The truth was that Chen had simply learned to be better at their game than they were. His military training, combined with years of experience in their territory, made him nearly impossible to catch. He knew every hiding place, every escape route, every weakness in their security procedures. He had become the ultimate survivor in a land that killed most intruders within weeks. Chen's isolation had also forced him to confront fundamental questions about his identity and purpose. Was he still a Navy SEAL if he had no team, no mission, no chain of command? Was he still serving his country by staying alive in enemy territory, or had he become something else entirely? These questions haunted him during the long, cold nights when survival required all his attention during the day. The radio intercepts that provided his only connection to the outside world brought disturbing news as his 6th year of isolation began. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan was accelerating, and it seemed likely that all U.S. forces would be gone within a few years. If that happened, Chen's chances of rescue would drop to zero, and his survival would become truly permanent rather than temporary. This realization forced Chen to consider options he had never seriously contemplated. Could he somehow make his way to Pakistan and find safety across the border? Should he try to contact local villagers and risk betrayal in exchange for a chance at getting a message to American forces? Or should he continue his solitary existence indefinitely, surviving until age or enemy action finally caught up with him? The decision would define not just his survival strategy but his very identity. After 6 years of isolation, Danny Chen was no longer the same man who had volunteered for that fatal diversion mission. He had become something unique, a warrior without a war, a soldier without an army, a ghost haunting the mountains of Afghanistan with no clear path home. Back in Virginia Beach, Master Chief Jake Morrison stood before the black granite wall that bore the names of fallen SEALs, his weathered hand tracing the letters that spelled out Danny Chen. 8 years had passed since that terrible night in Afghanistan, but Morrison visited this memorial every month without fail. The weight of leaving Chen behind had never lifted from his shoulders, despite official recognition that his decision had saved 11 lives. Morrison's career had continued to advance after that mission. He had been promoted twice, commanded other teams, and led dozens of successful operations. But success felt hollow when measured against the missing man who should have been sharing those achievements. Chen's empty place at team reunions and military ceremonies served as a constant reminder of the price of leadership in warfare. The other surviving team members had scattered across different assignments and duty stations, but they remained connected by their shared loss. Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez had left the Navy entirely after struggling with survivor's guilt. Staff Sergeant Tom Wilson had transferred to training duty, unable to face combat operations without his complete team. Each man dealt with Chen's absence in his own way, but none had truly moved beyond it. Morrison's wife Sarah had watched her husband wrestle with the demons of that night for 8 years. She understood that Jake blamed himself for Chen's death, despite the official reports that praised his tactical decision-making. The ceremony that awarded Morrison a Bronze Star for his leadership during the mission had been one of the hardest days of their marriage, as Jake felt he was being honored for abandoning a teammate. The memorial service for Chen had taken place 2 years after the mission, when the military officially changed his status from missing to killed in action. Morrison had delivered the eulogy to Chen's parents and siblings, struggling to find words that could explain why their son had been left behind in the Afghan mountains. The young man's sacrifice had saved lives, but that knowledge provided little comfort to a grieving family. Chen's parents, immigrants who had worked tirelessly to give their son opportunities in America, never fully understood the military explanations for their loss. Their son had joined the Navy to serve his adopted country, excelled in the most demanding training programs, and earned the respect of elite warriors. Yet somehow he had disappeared in a foreign land, and his body was never recovered for proper burial. Morrison had promised Chen's family that the search would continue, that their son would not be forgotten. But as years passed and American involvement in Afghanistan wound down, the reality became clear that no further rescue operations would be mounted. The official position was that Chen had died heroically while serving his country, and his name joined the long list of warriors who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The military bureaucracy had processed Chen's death with efficient compassion. His benefits were paid to his family, his medals were awarded posthumously, and his service record was sealed with honors. Life insurance provided financial security for his parents, while the Gold Star family designation gave them access to support services for relatives of fallen service members. The system worked exactly as designed, but it couldn't fill the emotional void left by their missing son. Morrison struggled with the knowledge that somewhere in Afghanistan, Chen's remains lay unrecovered. The thought of his former teammates' bones scattered in some remote mountain valley haunted Morrison's dreams and colored every subsequent mission. He had led successful operations in Iraq, Syria, and other theaters, but the ghost of Danny Chen followed him everywhere he went. The changing nature of American military involvement around the world meant that opportunities for returning to Chen's last known location were increasingly rare. Special operations forces were being redirected to new threats in different regions, while Afghanistan was being turned over to local military forces and international peacekeeping units. The window for any kind of recovery mission was rapidly closing. Morrison's current assignment involved training foreign military units in counterterrorism tactics, work that was important but felt disconnected from the direct action missions that had defined his career. The classroom environments and diplomatic protocols were a far cry from the mountains of Afghanistan, where he had learned the hardest lessons about leadership and sacrifice. During quiet moments between training sessions, Morrison found himself researching everything he could about the region where Chen had disappeared. Satellite imagery, intelligence reports, and news stories provided glimpses of an area that remained dangerous and unstable. Taliban control had strengthened in many mountain districts, making any kind of search operation extremely hazardous. The 10th anniversary of the mission approached with Morrison facing retirement from active duty. His 25 years of service had been distinguished by exceptional leadership and numerous decorations, but he knew he would leave the Navy with unfinished business. The promise he had made to Chen in those final moments before the separation haunted him more than any enemy fire he had faced. Sarah Morrison watched her husband prepare for civilian life while carrying the burden of his unresolved guilt. She knew that retirement would give Jake more time to think about Chen, possibly making his emotional struggle more difficult. The structure and purpose of military life had provided some distraction from his survivor's guilt, but civilian life offered fewer barriers between Morrison and his memories. Morrison's retirement ceremony was held at the same Virginia Beach base where he had trained with Chen years earlier. The citation read at the event praised his exceptional leadership under extreme combat conditions and unwavering dedication to the safety of his men. But Morrison heard those words as an indictment rather than praise, knowing that one of his men remained unaccounted for in hostile territory. Among the attendees at Morrison's retirement ceremony were several members of his old team, men who had served with Chen and shared Morrison's sense of unfinished business. They spoke privately about their missing teammate, sharing memories and reinforcing their mutual commitment to his memory. None of them mentioned the possibility of a private search mission, but the idea hung unspoken in the air between them. Civilian life proved as challenging as Morrison had expected. Without the daily routine of military service, he found himself with too much time to think about unresolved issues from his career. The house in Virginia Beach that had been a refuge from the demands of military life now felt like a prison, where his memories of Chen could torment him without interruption. Morrison began reaching out to private military contractors, intelligence analysts, and anyone else who might have current information about the remote Afghan province where Chen had disappeared. Most of the responses were discouraging. The area remained under Taliban control, with no American presence and minimal international monitoring. Any search would require significant resources and would face enormous risks. But Morrison's inquiries had an unexpected result. His questions attracted attention from other military personnel who had unresolved issues from the Afghan conflict. A network began to form, connecting veterans who felt that promises had been broken and obligations remained unfulfilled. These were men who had served their country faithfully but believed that America had abandoned commitments to recover missing personnel. The conversations that emerged from this network were careful and indirect, speaking in general terms about moral obligations and unfinished business, but gradually, a more concrete discussion began to develop around the possibility of private recovery missions for personnel who had been left behind when official military operations ended. Morrison discovered that he was not alone in his feelings of abandonment and guilt. Other team leaders shared similar stories of missing personnel, whose cases had been closed by official channels, but remained open wounds for the men who had served with them. The common thread was a belief that the military's withdrawal from Afghanistan had left unfinished business that violated the sacred promised to never leave a fallen comrade behind. The informal network included retired, special operations personnel, intelligence analysts, private military contractors, and even some active duty personnel who shared their frustrations privately. They exchanged information about missing personnel cases, shared intelligence about conditions in various regions, and gradually began discussing what civilian resources might be available for recovery operations. Morrison learned that technology had advanced significantly since Chen's disappearance. Satellite imagery was more detailed and accessible. Communication equipment was more reliable and portable, and private security companies had developed sophisticated capabilities for operating in denied territories. The tools existed for a professional search and recovery mission, but the political and legal obstacles were enormous. The most promising contact came from Marcus Reed, a former Army Ranger who now operated a private security company specializing in high-risk operations in unstable regions. Reed's company had contracts for protecting infrastructure projects and training local security forces, providing legitimate cover for operations in places like Afghanistan. More importantly, Reed had maintained contacts with Afghan nationals who could provide intelligence and logistical support. Reed's initial response to Morrison's inquiries was cautious but interested. He had handled similar cases in other regions and understood both the emotional motivations and practical challenges involved. A recovery mission in Taliban-controlled territory would require extensive planning, significant resources, and acceptance of substantial risks. But it was not impossible for a well-funded and professionally executed operation. The conversation with Reed forced Morrison to confront the reality of what he was contemplating. A private recovery mission would operate outside official channels, potentially violating laws regarding unauthorized military operations in foreign countries. The financial costs would be enormous, the risks to participants would be extreme, and the chances of success would be uncertain at best. But Morrison also realized that this might be his only opportunity to fulfill the promise he had made to Chen 12 years earlier. Official military channels had closed, diplomatic efforts had failed, and time was running out as conditions in Afghanistan continued to deteriorate. If he was going to act on his commitment to bring Chen home, it would have to be through private means. Morrison's wife Sarah watched her husband wrestle with this impossible decision. She understood his need to resolve the guilt that had haunted him for over a decade, but she also feared the consequences of a dangerous and potentially illegal mission. Their marriage had survived Morrison's military career and the emotional aftermath of losing Chen, but this new obsession threatened to destroy the peaceful retirement they had planned. The ethical questions were as complex as the practical ones. Did Morrison have the right to risk other people's lives on a mission to recover someone who had been officially declared dead 12 years earlier? Could he justify spending enormous amounts of money on what might be a futile gesture, when that money could be used for other worthy causes? Was his desire to find Chen about honoring a fallen comrade, or about resolving his own psychological needs? Morrison's research into Chen's disappearance had revealed disturbing information about the region where he had vanished. The area had become a stronghold for various extremist groups, with frequent battles between competing factions and minimal government control. Any American discovered in the region would face immediate execution, and rescue operations would be virtually impossible to organize. Yet the same intelligence reports that highlighted the dangers also suggested that the local population had stories about a foreign fighter who had operated in the mountains for many years. The descriptions were vague and possibly mythical, but they spoke of a man who struck enemy convoys and disappeared without trace, who seemed to know the terrain better than local guides, who had survived in the wilderness longer than anyone thought possible. Morrison's heart raced when he read these reports. Could Chen still be alive after 12 years of isolation? The possibility seemed impossible, but the stories were consistent enough to suggest some basis in reality. If there was even a small chance that Chen had survived, Morrison knew he had no choice but to investigate. The decision crystallized during a visit to Chen's parents on the 12th anniversary of the mission. Morrison had maintained contact with the family over the years, providing updates on any new information and ensuring they knew their son was not forgotten. But this visit was different, as Morrison found himself studying Chen's childhood photographs and military awards with new intensity. Chen's mother served tea in the same cup she had used for 12 years of anniversary visits, And Morrison realized that these grieving parents deserved more than official condolences and bureaucratic explanations. They deserved to know what had happened to their son and, if possible, to bring him home for proper burial. Morrison made his decision in that quiet living room, surrounded by the memories of a young man who had given everything for his teammates. The planning phase took 8 months and consumed Morrison's entire military retirement fund, plus additional loans secured against his house. Marcus Reed's private security company provided the framework for what they called a humanitarian recovery mission, designed to appear as a legitimate effort to locate and repatriate remains of American personnel. The legal fiction was thin, but it provided enough cover to proceed with equipment purchases and personnel recruitment. Reed assembled a team of 12 specialists, including former SEALs, Army Rangers, and Delta Force operators, who had all served in Afghanistan and understood the terrain and cultural challenges. Each man volunteered for personal reasons. Some had their own missing teammates. Others felt obligated to support Morrison's quest, and all shared the belief that promises to fallen comrades transcended official military policy. The intelligence preparation was exhaustive. Satellite imagery from commercial providers was analyzed to identify potential landing zones, supply caches, and escape routes. Local contacts developed through Reed's business operations provided updates on Taliban movements, tribal politics, and the general security situation in Chen's last known area. The team studied weather patterns, seasonal variations, and historical precedents for operations in the region. Morrison mortgaged his future to fund the mission, but money also came from unexpected sources. Chen's former teammates contributed from their own savings. His parents offered their life insurance payout, and even strangers who learned about the mission through veterans' networks sent donations. The financial support reflected a broader belief that America's promise to never leave anyone behind should not be abandoned when official policies changed. The team's cover story involved a contract to assess infrastructure damage in remote Afghan provinces for an international development organization. Reed's company had legitimate business relationships that made such a mission plausible, and the paperwork was carefully crafted to withstand casual inspection. But everyone understood that if they were discovered by hostile forces, their cover would provide no protection. Training took place at a private facility in Nevada that replicated Afghan terrain and conditions. The team practiced helicopter insertions, mountain warfare tactics, and medical procedures for treating casualties in austere environments. Morrison, at 52 years old, pushed himself through the same demanding preparation as men 20 years younger, driven by his determination to fulfill the promise he had made 12 years earlier. The most challenging aspect of the preparation was psychological. Every team member understood that Chen was almost certainly dead after 12 years of isolation in hostile territory. The mission was primarily about recovery and closure rather than rescue, but Morrison insisted on planning for all possibilities. If Chen was somehow still alive, they would need medical supplies, transportation capability, and extraction plans suitable for an injured and potentially traumatized survivor. Reed's contacts in Afghanistan provided disturbing intelligence about the target area. Taliban control had strengthened significantly, with multiple checkpoints and regular patrols throughout the mountain districts, but they also confirmed the persistent stories about a ghost fighter who operated in the region, a mysterious figure who attacked supply, convoys, and disappeared before counterattacks could be organized. The stories varied in detail but shared common elements that made Morrison's pulse quicken. The ghost fighter was described as unusually skilled, familiar with American military tactics, and capable of surviving in the mountains indefinitely. Local commanders had offered bounties for his capture, but no one had ever come close to finding his base of operations or predicting his movements. Morrison studied these intelligence reports with the intensity of a man whose life depended on their accuracy. If Chen was alive and had become this legendary ghost fighter, the rescue mission would require completely different tactics. Instead of searching for remains or crash sites, they would need to make contact with a man who had learned to trust no one and kill anyone who threatened his survival. The mission launch came in early spring when weather conditions and enemy activity patterns were most favorable. The team infiltrated Afghanistan through Pakistan, using documents that identified them as infrastructure consultants working for Reed's company. Their equipment was shipped separately through legitimate commercial channels, disguised as surveying, instruments, and communication gear for development projects. Morrison felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread as the helicopter lifted off from their forward base near the Pakistani border. 12 years after leaving Chen behind in these same mountains, he was returning with the resources and determination needed to bring his teammate home. But the landscape below looked even more hostile than he remembered, scarred by years of conflict and controlled by forces that would kill them all without hesitation. The insertion went smoothly, with the team landing at a remote site 15 kilometers from Chen's last known position. The helicopter departed immediately, leaving 12 men alone in Taliban territory with enough supplies for 2 weeks of operations. Morrison looked around at his companions, professional warriors, who had risked everything to honor a promise made to a fallen comrade, and felt both gratitude and terror at the responsibility he carried. Movement through the mountains was slower than Morrison remembered from his younger days, but the team's experience and preparation showed in their tactical discipline. They avoided known patrol routes, used natural concealment effectively, and maintained communication security that would prevent enemy forces from detecting their presence. The first phase of the mission involved reaching Chen's last known location and beginning a systematic search pattern. The compound where Chen had made his final stand was exactly as Morrison remembered it, but 12 years of weather and neglect had reduced it to rubble and scattered stones. The team spent hours searching for any trace of Chen's presence or clues about his fate, but found nothing that hadn't been discovered by previous search efforts. The official military investigation had been thorough, and civilian looters had removed anything of value years earlier. Morrison's heart sank as the search of the compound yielded no new information. He had hoped for some sign that Chen had survived the initial separation, but the site offered no evidence either way. The team would have to expand their search into the broader mountain area, following rumors and local stories about the mysterious ghost fighter who might or might not be Chen. Local intelligence provided by Reed's contacts directed them toward areas where the ghost fighter had been most active. The pattern of attack showed sophisticated knowledge of military tactics and intimate familiarity with the terrain. Convoy ambush sites revealed evidence of careful planning and professional execution that went far beyond typical Taliban capabilities. Morrison studied the ambush sites with growing excitement and concern. The tactical signatures were consistent with SEAL training, but they also showed evolution and adaptation that suggested years of independent operations. If Chen was responsible for these attacks, he had not only survived but had become a more dangerous warrior than the young communications specialist. Morrison remembered. The breakthrough came on their 7th day in the mountains when they discovered a cave system that showed signs of long-term habitation, hidden from casual observation but accessible to someone who knew the terrain. The caves contained evidence of human presence spanning many years. Supply caches, communication equipment, and personal items suggested that someone had used this location as a base of operations. Morrison's hands trembled as he examined items found deep in the cave system. Military equipment that could have come from Chen's original loadout, modified and maintained over years of use. Food supplies and medical materials that indicated careful planning for long-term survival. Most significantly, a radio frequency list that matched the tactical communication procedures used by Chen's original team. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Someone with extensive military training and intimate knowledge of American special operations procedures had lived in these caves for years. They had survived in the harshest possible environment while conducting a private war against enemy forces throughout the region. Morrison allowed himself to hope that Danny Chen was not only alive, but had become a legend in his own right. But finding evidence of Chen's survival was very different from making contact with him. The man who had lived alone in these mountains for 12 years would not trust anyone, especially Americans who might be enemy operatives attempting to lure him into a trap. Morrison realized that the hardest part of the mission was just beginning, convincing Chen that his teammates had finally returned to bring him home. Morrison decided to use the old tactical communication procedures that only Chen would recognize. Every night at midnight, the team broadcast on the emergency frequency Chen had used during their original mission. transmitting a coded message that identified Morrison by his call sign and referenced specific details that only team members would know. The transmissions were brief and cryptic, designed to avoid detection by enemy monitoring while providing unmistakable authentication to Chen if he was listening. For 3 nights, the radio calls went unanswered. Morrison began to fear that either Chen was dead or had moved beyond the range of their communications equipment. The team had limited time before their extraction window, and every day in the mountains increased the risk of discovery by Taliban patrols. But Morrison refused to abandon the effort until he had exhausted every possibility. On the 4th night, the radio crackled with a response that made Morrison's heart stop. A voice, weathered and cautious, spoke the correct authentication codes from their original mission 12 years earlier. The voice was older, rougher, and filled with suspicion, but Morrison recognized the speech patterns and technical knowledge that could only belong to Danny Chen. The initial contact was brief and guarded. Chen demanded additional authentication before he would reveal his location or agree to a meeting. Morrison provided details about their original team, their training, and personal information that only Chen would remember. Gradually, the voice on the radio became more familiar, though still cautious after 12 years of trusting no one but himself. Chen's survival story emerged in fragments during their radio conversations. He had indeed become the ghost fighter of local legend, conducting a private war against enemy forces while avoiding all human contact. The cave system Morrison's team had discovered was one of several bases Chen had established throughout the mountain region. His attacks on enemy convoys had been motivated partly by survival needs, but mainly by a determination to continue his mission despite being abandoned. The reunion meeting was arranged for dawn, on a remote mountainside that Chen could observe from multiple directions. Morrison approached the designated location alone, as Chen had insisted, while the rest of the team provided overwatch from concealed positions. Morrison's hands shook as he climbed toward the meeting point, knowing that he was about to face a man he had left for dead 12 years earlier. Chen emerged from the rocks like a specter, his appearance so changed that Morrison might not have recognized him in different circumstances. The young SEAL had been replaced by a lean, bearded warrior, whose eyes held the hard intelligence of someone who had survived the impossible. His equipment was a mixture of captured enemy gear and improvised modifications that showed both desperation and ingenuity. The first moment of recognition was electric and painful. Chen studied Morrison's face with an expression that mixed joy, anger, and disbelief. Morrison saw in Chen's eyes the accumulated weight of 12 years of isolation, betrayal, and survival against overwhelming odds. The reunion Morrison had dreamed of was complicated by emotions neither man had fully prepared to face. Chen's first words were not what Morrison expected. Instead of relief or gratitude, Chen expressed anger at being abandoned and forgotten. He had monitored American military communications for years, listening to reports of other rescue missions while his own case was closed and forgotten. The man who had once been willing to sacrifice himself for his teammates now struggled to trust the very people who had left him behind. Morrison tried to explain the circumstances that had led to the failed rescue attempts, the official designation of Chen as killed in action, and his own years of guilt and determination to return. But 12 years of isolation had changed Chen in ways that made communication difficult. He had become accustomed to complete self-reliance and viewed any dependence on others as potentially fatal weakness. The conversation revealed that Chen had developed an extensive intelligence network among local populations, gaining their respect through his resistance to Taliban forces. He had learned local languages, understood tribal politics, and could move through the region with a freedom that no American military unit could achieve. In many ways, he had become more effective as a solo operative than he had ever been as part of a team. Chen's reluctance to leave his mountain stronghold reflected more than just caution about the rescue mission. The life he had built in isolation was harsh and dangerous, but it was entirely under his control. Returning to American society would mean giving up the independence he had fought to maintain, and trusting in institutions that had already failed him once. Morrison realized that convincing Chen to leave would require more than just proving the rescue mission was legitimate. He needed to address Chen's fundamental loss of faith in the military system and his fear of being betrayed again. The conversation became less about extraction procedures, and more about rebuilding trust that had been shattered by 12 years of abandonment. The breakthrough came when Morrison shared intelligence about Chen's family and former teammates. Chen's parents were still alive and had never stopped hoping for his return. His former teammates had carried the guilt of leaving him behind and had contributed to funding the rescue mission. The man who had been forgotten by the military, bureaucracy had never been forgotten by the people who mattered most. Chen's emotional walls began to crumble as Morrison provided updates about the lives he had left behind. His parents had aged but remained healthy, sustained by their belief that their son was still alive somewhere. His teammates had successful careers but carried the same guilt that had driven Morrison to organize the rescue mission. The wider world had moved on, but the people who loved Chen had never given up hope. The tactical challenge of extraction required Chen to trust not only Morrison, but also the team members he had never met. Men who had risked their lives and careers to honor a promise made to a missing comrade they had never served with. Chen studied their faces and listened to their stories, gradually accepting that some bonds of brotherhood transcended personal acquaintance. Chen's survival skills proved invaluable during the extraction planning. His knowledge of enemy patrol patterns, safe routes through the mountains, and local weather conditions gave the team advantages they could never have achieved alone. The student became the teacher as Chen briefed his rescuers on the realities of operating in territory he had made his private battlefield. The journey to the extraction point took 3 days of careful movement through terrain that Chen navigated with the confidence of someone who had called it home for over a decade. Morrison watched in amazement as his former teammate moved through the landscape like a ghost, invisible to enemy patrols that passed within meters of their position. At the extraction site, Chen faced his final moment of decision. The helicopter that would carry him away from Afghanistan represented safety and reunion with his family, but it also meant leaving behind the life he had built through 12 years of struggle. Morrison watched Chen's face as he made the choice between the familiar dangers of his mountain refuge and the uncertain promises of a rescue mission. Chen climbed aboard the helicopter with the same quiet determination he had shown during their original mission 12 years earlier. As the aircraft lifted off and the Afghan mountains fell away below them, Morrison saw tears in Chen's eyes for the first time since their reunion. The man who had survived alone for 12 years was finally allowing himself to believe that his long isolation was over. The flight to the forward base was conducted in relative silence as Chen processed the reality of his rescue. Morrison sat beside his long-lost teammate, still hardly believing that the mission had succeeded. After 12 years of guilt and searching, he had finally fulfilled the promise made during those desperate moments in the enemy compound. At the base, Chen faced the overwhelming challenge of reintegrating with a world that had moved on without him. Medical evaluations, intelligence debriefings, and psychological assessments awaited him, along with the complex process of resuming a life that had been officially ended 12 years earlier. But for Morrison, watching Chen board the transport aircraft for the flight home, the most important promise of his military career had finally been kept. The reunion with Chen's parents at the airport was witnessed by former teammates, military officials, and media representatives who struggled to understand how someone could survive alone for 12 years in enemy territory. But for Morrison and the men who had risked everything to bring Chen home, the explanations were simple. They had honored the sacred promise that no one is left behind. Even when official channels had failed and hope seemed impossible, Chen's reintegration into American society would take years and would never be completely successful. Too much had changed, and he had adapted too thoroughly to his solitary existence. But he was alive, he was home, and he was surrounded by people who had never forgotten him. For Morrison, that was enough to finally lay his ghosts to rest.